Good, y'all. How we doing? How we doing? Hope everybody's been blessed. It's your boy Coffee Kid back with another episode of The Observation. It is 9:43 p.m. April 23rd, 2023. Today we got a video from the New Economic Thinking Network. Forget the name of the guy who hosts these, but he has Sandra Navidi on today, so I just wanted to take a quick peek at the author slash interviewee on this episode in question. Sandra Navidi, born in Mönchengladbach, Germany, to an Iranian father and a German mother. Very interesting, very interesting. Law degree, Master of Law in Banking, Corporate and Finance Law. Studied at some pretty prestigious places. Oh, I have a cousin who was in Berkeley. Went there. Interesting. Tax lawyer. She's a macroeconomic consultant. So, seems like she comes from, elite education. She comes from, let's see. She probably comes from some sort of prestigious family. Maybe I'm assuming that incorrectly, but nah, she seems like a very interesting person. Author, speaker, I'm sure. Okay, yeah, so this is the book that she is discussing on this episode of New Economic Thinking. So I guess that's just some context for y'all. Keep those things in mind, her background in mind as she speaks. I think that's an important thing to do when dissecting someone's opinion or facts they present. But nevertheless, let's hop into the video.
I'm here today with Sandra Navidi, the founder and chief executive of Beyond Global, an international consulting firm. We're here to talk about her book, Super Hubs: How the Financial Elite and Their Networks Rule the World. Sandra, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Rob. Pleasure to be here.
This book interests me in so many different dimensions. As you know, the Institute for New Economic Thinking is involved in network theory and complex systems and so forth. But you actually added the texture of people onto this, how people become the magnets inside these networks and how they work effectively or not so effectively, how think tanks interact with them. So you've added a great deal of what you might call textured human understanding of what these networks are. This isn't just a cell phone grid. This involves people.
Well, yes, what I wanted to show is that finance is essentially a human system. It's not abstract institutions or abstract globalization or capital flows or quantitative models. It's people who make decisions, people who preside over these institutions. And there's an interesting study the Swiss Institute of Technology did to show that only a handful of financial institutions worldwide hold global corporate control of most corporations in the world, and that of course gives the people who are in charge of these corporations enormous power, and many of them are very famous financial institutions like JP Morgan, Barclays, and so forth.
But there are also people within these groups, and you've talked about various people that the INET community is very familiar with. A lot of these people are practicing what you preach in many, many dimensions.
Yes, I wanted to explain how these people become super hubs, and maybe just to explain, super hubs are the nodes within networks that are the most connected, and by virtue of their connections, they move into the center of the network. We are all nodes within the network, and nodes in any network, that could be the ecology or our brain or an ant colony, all nodes prefer to attach to other nodes who already have many connections, because connections are a guarantee for survival, or make survival more likely. And so these people strive to be super hubs, and they maintain their super hub position with their connections. And the safest way to do that is to build networks. And that's, for instance, because you mentioned Steve Schwarzman with the network that he's building in China, and he's building overlapping networks. And we see that with many of these super hubs, that they're proactively actually building networks where they're in the middle and they preside over the information flow and all sorts of network currencies like money that flow over these pathways.
These, what you might call connection between commerce and the demonstration of intellect and imagination is a very interesting, I would say, part of what constitutes a magnetic field for being at the center of a super hub.
Yes, connections are exceedingly important because while individual superhubs have immense power, what makes them extremely or increases their power exponentially is their connections, because in any network, the nodes have limited ability to speak to what the network does or to the network's behavior. What's really what determines the network behavior is the connections between those individual nodes. And these people, the superhubs, increase their power through multi-layered, multidimensional networks. So it's most efficient if you connect a financial network with a political network and the corporate network. Then you've got basically all bases covered. And if you can throw in philanthropy and culture, you fortify this kind of structure.
Well, there's certain, how would I say, enthusiasm associated with your insight and admiration for people who've mastered these skills. You've also talked about ones that have broken down. Specific examples of people who've been at the hub of a network, and these are not what we might call cast in stone. They're human organisms that sometimes fail, and some people who fall out come back in. I'm curious how you see that dynamic process. Without necessarily picking on any individual, what happens when a network hub fails and is what you might call cast out of the flow?
Superhubs get expelled from the system because of their grave violations, and sometimes they're allowed back in. But I think someone like Dick Fulp, for instance, has not reemerged. Someone like Dominique Strauss-Kahn is trying to come back. And I say in the book, what really distinguishes superhubs, everybody in that sphere at the very top of the financial system is very smart and is very industrious and has gotten an elite education. But what makes the ultimate competitive advantage is their ability to build relationships.
So it's an emotional intelligence rather than an IQ which is the secret sauce in this instance.
Exactly, which is often underrated because it doesn't enjoy the same prestige as do hard skills like a measurable education. But when these people have basically violated the rules of the system and have violated the rules of relationships, that's why they get expelled, and not all of them manage to make a comeback.
All of this is a very interesting question. What makes, other than just what you might call plain old jealousy, what makes these systems vulnerable to collapse or to degeneration?
It's network dynamics. It's a law of nature. That's why I say it's not a conspiracy. All networks over time have the tendency to become more homogeneous and more interlinked. And that's why they become skewed after a while. A good example, for instance, is the ecology, where after a while when a system gets skewed, corrective mechanisms kick in, corrective feedback loops that rebalance the system. And what I argue in the book is that these superhubs try to optimize the system for themselves. Like everybody, every person acts in their own self-interest. It's actually, not unethical per se, but they act all in their own interest. They build ever more connections. The system gets skewed. They disable corrective mechanisms like, for instance, regulatory reform. And then after a while, the system becomes fragile. And I actually think Brexit or polarization and populism in Europe and the election here in the United States are a manifestation of that.
And you're touching on something very important here. When people manage these networks, and you talk about them as being multifaceted, political, cultural, artistic, financial, when they get so powerful, they start to have disproportionate influence on the public infrastructure. So that you can see the people outside the network feeling like they were part of the society, but now, as Donald Trump said, the system is rigged, and they start to react against, the exercise of power within the network.
Yes, they're basically trying to rebalance the system, and it's also a result of network dynamics, homogeneity, homophily actually is called in network science, like and like attracts. So these people go to the same schools, they live in the same neighborhoods, they have the same interests. not even intentionally and often subconsciously, they exclude others who are not like them. And there's one difference that is very hard to bridge, and that is socioeconomic difference. People who come from a different strata of society, who have a different accent, who have different experiences, have a harder time breaking into the system, because there's this thing called airport test, where in interviews, job interviews, those people who interview, who are the people in power at companies, subconsciously exclude people who are different, who may have also an equally as good education as somebody else from the same school, but they can't relate to that person so well. And so that's why the system becomes more homogeneous over time. That is also a reason why there are so few women and other minorities.
Now we're in this realm of EQ, not IQ. You can have a very high IQ, but if you're outside the circle of characteristics, people feel unsafe around you, and your abilities are not realized or not rewarded, either through hiring or through compensation or through promotion. So it's a very interesting, aspect of this network phenomenon.
And it's self-perpetuating. A manifestation is also assortative mating. First of all, when a college education became more available, people in rural areas would be drawn more to the coastal areas or more prosperous areas. And so we saw basically a brain drain. And then what happened was assortative mating, that people from the same socioeconomic background would marry each other, and their offspring would, of course, be much better off, and they would be able to give their children access to better education and opportunities. So that's why the system is, again, becoming more homogeneous, more concentrated, more skewed.
Now, you talk about the safety of identifying people, forming a network, and being in the network. But in the aftermath of a rebellion against the network, like, say, the election of Donald Trump, where he's saying the system is rigged, I've seen a lot of backlash on the part of the elites, the people who have prestigious degrees, towards the population as a whole. I don't know how our society heals itself when the people who have the degrees, have been in the networks, have had all the benefits, experience, rather than empathy for the people who were in despair, engage them with ridicule. I had hoped, like, the election would teach us all a lesson. It would be like a lightning bolt, a wake-up call, that we would lose our false innocence and we would build a more humanly, caring society. But we may have to go through more pain before we can get to that point.
I actually feel I have seen some empathy and some people being self-critical, but I do agree that we will probably see more pain, because I think Donald Trump is even more polarizing. He's pitting people against each other, minorities against each other, and against the establishment, everybody against everybody, basically. And I think that is very toxic.
And we see within the Democratic Party a civil war going on. So it's not just Donald Trump and his surroundings. Everything's come a little bit loose. And this so-called super hub system is going through some convulsions right now.
But the danger is also when a system rearranges, and I give as an example the change from the Soviet Union to Russia, which gave rise to Putin and a handful of oligarchs who, again, were well connected in networks to government and who had access to capital. That led to even more polarization, and Putin's personal fortune is estimated to be over $200 billion. And you have the oligarchs, and I think the tendency with Trump is also that it's becoming more exclusive. We're seeing the nepotism. He's bringing his family in, he's bringing loyalists in. It's becoming even more homogeneous. It's just older white men. It's network science at an extreme, because in a system like that, it's basically a closed system where relationships become all decisive. If you don't have a relationship to Trump of trust, you're not going to get in.
So in Greek mythology, they call this hubris. Things go until they become unsustainable, and then they collapse under their own weight.
Exactly.
And I want to go back, though. I mean, I find this book, like I said, fascinating because it has a human feel to it. It has a logical feel to it. When did you start building the hypothesis to create this book? When did you see, what was the time of, like, recognition that this was the process that was unfolding?
I think the first document I saved on this book was 2011. It was an evolution, and I originally had started writing about networks as a blueprint to how the world works, but it was too amorphous a subject. I always got sidetracked with interesting research, but couldn't pull together a book. And then I thought, why don't I just focus on the super hubs and CEOs? But that again was a very wide field, and I would always get sidetracked back to finance because that's my professional background. And so in the end, I thought, why don't I just write about what I know best, which is finance? And basically, finance is the operating system of our world, of our society anyway. Everything we do is based on our financial system and our relationships.
But I know a lot of people like yourself that spent time on Wall Street working in the transaction flow and so forth that never had what you might call this kind of pattern recognition about how the meta system is organized.
Oh, thank you.
And I think that's quite extraordinary. And how you arrived at that insight, I think I'm very curious about.
Well, I started in structured finance when I was still working at Deloitte & Touche in Germany, so I saw how the sausage is made, even though I didn't have a wider understanding of the context. And then I got an offer from a client to work in the United States as in-house counsel, and when you at an investment firm, and when you work on transactions like CDOs, or you have to pull together a hedge fund or a private equity fund, you really have to understand the structure, or else you can't draft the documents. And then I worked for a brief while in investment banking. And then I worked with Nouriel Roubini, the economist, who's a macroeconomist.
So and wrote the forward to your book, right?
Yes, he was kind enough.
That's
yes.
Great.
And so I feel I got, a 5,000 level view, a 10,000 level, always a little higher. But I also could relate to the base, to the individual transactions.
But how would I say? You kind of move from that abstract place of the finance and the financial flows to the human place of what is the glue that puts it all together, and what are the characteristics of those people. And I think that's a fascinating, I would say, second layer. And it's like contemporary history that you're writing.
Well, I had the privilege to interact with most of the super apps that I write about, and I felt that that's an aspect, the human aspect is often neglected. We focus so much on dogma and theories and quantitative models and leave out really what is at the base of it all. And when now we discuss, our computer networks taking over robots, machines, that is all true, but we must not forget that it's people like a Peter Thiel or financiers who even make the decision what gets financed, where do they throw their money behind or their influence, which projects are they banned, and even governments can switch off the internet. We've seen it in Egypt, we've seen it even in the United States, in San Francisco and Boston. So in the end, it always comes back to people. Thing called airport.
Interesting. Very interesting insight from Miss Navidi. Super hubs. And I think, for starters, I'm glad we prefaced it with her background, because just towards the end of the video, she talks about her, being on the front lines at different levels, whether it's an analyst, whether it's in-house counsel, whether it's an executive decision maker. She's seen networks and super hubs unfold before her eyes. She's been a part of them to some extent. So it's interesting how she correlates different networks. She came from the financial side, but as I was jotting down notes, she also talks about corporate networks, political networks, and financial networks all intermingle. And then you have some philanthropical and cultural networks sprinkled in that certify those or hide them in a certain way. So yeah, really a lot to unpack. That's a very interesting take. I'm going to have to read the book at some point. See if I can find it. He doesn't leave. I'll find the name of the book. But yeah, I'm sure it's a great read. And I think what her realization was very much in front of her the whole time, is regardless of the complex quantitative analysis of how these networks flow and interact, regardless of even the network dynamics of how decisions get made and how people groups move and shift their preferences, and how should I, and live and navigate how they're gonna rule, grow, expand. As those things unfold, she came to the realization that people rule these networks and the flows that happen within these networks. So the base of it is people. People rule those networks. So the next question is, what rules people? What rules their governing conscience? Their governing, who's that voice, that decision maker that drives them to do something? If people rule networks, well, who rules people? Who rules the way that they, make decisions, like I said. So that's one question that maybe she answers deeper in the book, because if she drilled down past all her elite education, all her experience professionally, and she made this observation about how networks interact, but then also drilled down to the fact that it's ultimately people. Well, then what's the next step in my thinking? And maybe she answers it in the book. What drives people? And that, now you're entering a different field. Now you're entering morality. You're entering psychology. You're entering nature, human nature, the root of why we do things. So that's a whole nother branch of this conversation. But yeah, I also, jotted some stuff about her notion on network dynamics, how networks are homogeneous. So I know in past videos, a lot of what I've been talking about is very Afrocentric in nature. I've been covering things that relate to the transition of African people and the African conscience and the African networks, and the decision making in that level. So when you talk about network dynamics, if networks are homogeneous, they naturally exclude, whether intentional or unintentional. So in the modern frame of network dynamics, yes, people rule these networks, but what is the conduit by which people propagate their thoughts, their opinions, and ultimately their flow of money and influence? Nowadays, I think it used to be newspaper, it used to be TV, it used to be mainly those two. Now you have social media, and still news is a big thing, but news has adopted those new social media platforms. So really, it's all decentralized. It's very much at your fingertips from a device standpoint. Like your information and the information flow is a lot more decentralized, just with the sheer number of devices that are capable of displaying information. So when she mentions that corporate, political, and financial networks, this is what came to my mind. And then you sprinkle in cultural networks. Well, corporate, political, and financial networks are taking place on these mediums. they're taking place on digital mediums at your fingertips. So in the same place that you could make a financial decision, or the same place that you could make a business decision, the same place that you could make a political decision, is the same place that information related to cultural flows and opinions is also occurring, right? Everything's happening in one place if you want it to. And it's all touchscreen. You can navigate it the way you want to. So if people's worlds and networks are in the palm of their hands, when you combine that with, I mean, she touched on it a little bit. When you combine that with artificial intelligence and suggested things based off patterns of behavior, the homogeneous nature of those networks is even strengthened. Like, because the artificial intelligence, down the road is gonna feed you things that keep you captivated on that on your device. It's not gonna feed you something you don't want to see. So inherently, your cultural information flow is biased. You're becoming more homogeneous. And this video was when 2017. So before the rush on the Capitol. This is crazy. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a hypothesis, right? But some of it was proven. It hadn't even happened yet. And what she's talking about, network dynamics being homogeneous and have a lot of nepotism involved in them by nature, divide people and exclude people, but also empower people to act in more extreme measures in order to protect their desire for similarity and homogeneous network dynamics. And she said that 3 years before the rush on the Capitol, when she was referencing Trump's divisive nature, right? So not taking a political stance, but her observation very, very, very much unfolded before her eyes. So, but it's interesting if I were to step in to the biblical lens, which is really the only reliance that we have, is we're told that nothing is new. Everything that we see there's nothing new or original under the sun. Everything that has been thought of or created has been created before. This world is very old. So even the theory of network dynamics and the human conscience and nature that powers network dynamics, existed. It's never not existed. Even someone's understanding or theory around it has been existed, I'm sure, in another lifetime. Right now, you could argue America is just the newest dynasty, and with technology and the Industrial Revolution, multiple empires are able to exist and coexist because we tend to gravitate towards peace. Peace has increased our ability to survive. But back in the day, the biggest dynasties, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, they all had their rise and they all had their demise. And I've seen some economists, Ray Dalio, he's a famed economist, talks about the 400-year theory that empires have a cycle, just like any other economic micro or macroeconomic cycle has a timeline associated with the rise and fall of the cycle and the repeat of the cycle. He said that empires in his research had a 400-year cycles, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, etc., etc. Now that's just a theory, but nevertheless, it just goes to show that nothing's new. I'm sure there were network dynamics within Egypt, within Rome, within the Greek dynasties within the Persian empires. And I'm sure there were people in those elite networks that understood how network dynamics unfolded and how they sustained this elite ability to be elite in comparison to others. But I don't know. I think it's interesting, and I think if there's a resolution to it, if the root of these networks, and if they call because of their exclusion, characteristics to exclude, if that's a side effect, and we know the root of it is people, how can we address what rules the people? What drives our nature? How do you unpack that? For me, I'm gonna go to this verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. For some context, Paul is writing a letter to the church in Corinth. He's writing a letter because this church is undergoing their own network dynamics. People are, they're trying to live out the way and the truth, acknowledging that Jesus died on the cross and rose again for our sins, but living in that while also still being human. Those network dynamics, even within the early rise of the church, are in existence. People are doing things their own way. People are, certain people are rising up as the wise teachers, and there's power dynamics in the church, and Paul's the one who evangelized the gospel to them originally, so that's why he catches wind of what's going on in turmoil, and now he's writing a letter to them. So 1 Corinthians, this verse is a letter to that body of people. Paul says, I came to you in weakness, with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. No, we declare God's wisdom, a mystery that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. What we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness. Listen to that. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness, and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. The person with the Spirit makes judgments about all things, but such a person is not subject to merely human judgments. So my reflection on this and how it relates to this is that if she's saying people are the root of these networks, and the simultaneous follow-up question to that is, if people rule those networks, who rules people? Who rules the nature of people? Only the Spirit of God can reveal to us the truth. No wisdom of the world can. The wisdom of the world killed the Son of God. It has no discernment because it is not of God. The wisdom of the world, in our nature to survive and propagate ourselves, and exclude through our network dynamics, which is driven by our nature. If you take it back to the beginning, our nature separated us from God. Yes, Satan tempted, but the temptation doesn't work if you don't make the action. So we are complicit in our own fall. So part of that is in our nature. And when I'm just mentally dissecting the network dynamics that she's saying power these elite financial, corporate, and political networks, and they all intermingle and they all stick together. They're loosely connected, friend of a friend type of vibe. When you peel that back, and it's ultimately their human nature at the root of it that controls those network dynamics. It's perplexing, but we already have an answer. We have an answer as to why that is in the Bible. And even in the body of the church, Paul is saying the wisdom of part of the wisdom he's talking about the wisdom of the world considers the faith foolish, the faith in a higher purpose and being considers it foolish, because their human nature, their wisdom rules the day, and it propagates these network dynamics that ultimately rule the world. So I don't necessarily know if I have a resolution to these particular things, network dynamics, but from the scripture we know that the world is dying as we know it. And even in your own life, in my own life, let's say, I'm only going to be alive for, God's willing, 90, 100 years maybe, right? So you have to come to terms with, if I was on the other side and I was reaping the benefits of this network dynamics, so what, I'm just living 100 years as in the elite class, and then what? Do I feel vindicated because I left something of great value for the people to follow me, when I'm already of the understanding that the world is dying as we know it? Or am I better off vindicating my spirit and separating my spirit from the wisdom that the world is pursuing? It's a toss up, right? It's faith. That's what faith is. So it's like that's my resolution to this problem. You're never gonna defeat these networks. We know in Revelations the last days will be tough, and I'm sure these networks will still be the rule the day, when those times come to fruition. But the resolution is the same. The resolution is the same. So I think I'm gonna leave it there. Very thought-provoking video, and two, if we're being real, two perspectives in this video are coming from Eurocentric backgrounds, but they're still drawing back all the way to humans. Yes, we're different and networks are homogeneous, but at our core, our human nature is very much the same. If the roles were reversed and Africans ruled these elite financial networks, chances are the result would be the same. And you see it in Africa even. Africa is in many ways a disparaged country. But there is a lot of wealthy people there. There's a lot of, good cities. Africa is a misconceived place. There's good cities and modern cities with, good rising infrastructure, but the overall GDP is weighed down by the extreme poverty. And there really is no large booming middle class. It's very much segmented. But even the elite that do exist, they are still victims of these same network effects. I say victims when it's kind of also victim but participant in these same network effects. So the elite will always separate, and the homogeneous nature of these network dynamics occurs regardless of what race or what ethnicity is participating in these elite network dynamics. So, you know, it doesn't matter. It's not a race thing. But yeah. With that, it's been another episode of The Observation, where we talk about what it was and what it is. Your boy Coffee Kid. I'm gonna wish y'all a blessed week. But yeah, I'm out.